Next is the dermis. We talk about the composition of the dermis. We've already mentioned component cell types of the epidermis. Here it's mostly keratinocytes. We talked about the different layers of the epidermis in there: stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum corneum. There's a fifth layer in thick skin. That would be the stratum lucidum between the granulosum and the corneum. We've talked about the different other cell types that can be found in among all this epithelial cells up here, the melanocytes, Merkel's cells, Langerhans cells that are also found in the epithelial layer. We've talked about the structure of a hair follicle and the different glands, the sebaceous gland that is attached to a hair follicle. Here's a sweat gland shown here. So now let's talk about the dermis layer down here. The uppermost zone of the dermis, we've already mentioned it before when we were talking about the different tissue types. The loose connective tissue occupies the most superficial region of the dermis here. So this region right here is referred to as the papillary layer of the dermis, the most superficial layer of the dermis, up close to the epithelium, and it's called the papillary layer because of the presence of dermal papillae. The papillae are these little bump-like things that stick up into the epidermis from the dermis right here. So this here is a dermal papilla. A dermal papilla. Those are numerous and they're more exaggerated where your skin is thicker, where your skin is not put under the pressures that you see in your hands and feet and other locations where there's more friction or pressure on the skin. You're going to have less exaggerated dermal papillae in there. But anyway, basically a loose connective tissue making up this papillary layer of the dermis, the uppermost layer. So this is the papillary layer. Of the dermis, and then down below that you get into dense, irregular connective tissue. It looks a little bit different, has heavier collagen bundles scattered through the next zone, this reticular layer of the dermis. So the papillary layer of the dermis is relatively thin. The reticular layer of the dermis with the dense irregular connective tissue is relatively thick. And this is the kind of material, this dense irregular connective tissue here, that makes up leather. When you talk about making a leather belt or billfold or something like that, shoes, the leather that's found in there, mostly made of this material right here, these heavy collagen fibers found in the reticular layer of the dermis. So this is the reticular layer. Next, I want to illustrate the presence of a kind of smooth muscle. We've talked about that also in here. That is attached to the base of a hair follicle and extends up through the into the surface layers here. This is the erector pili muscle. So this is my erector pili muscle I'm drawing in here. Small smooth muscle that extends from near the base of a hair follicle up through it, usually adjacent to the sebaceous gland. erector pili muscle. Next, within the reticular and papillary layers of the dermis, there are going to be quite a few blood vessels in there, and it's a little hard to make them look different from everything else. So I'm going to draw them in blue. So this would represent a blood vessel here, passing through here. Sometimes you just catch cross sections. You see them in cross section in the tissue. Sometimes they're larger, sometimes they're smaller. They can be arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, whatever. So anyway, there are blood vessels scattered through there. And finally, let's see, we run out of colors here pretty well. There are nerve fibers that pass through, and I'll just make a few of these bundles of nerve fibers here. I'm just going to make a little dotted pattern in a circle here to represent a nerve bundle passing through the skin. Different locations in here, you're going to see these nerve fibers passing through in a bundle. Now, some of these nerve fibers are going to branch out and become small nerve fibers that reach up toward the surface of the skin. All through here there would be small nerves passing through, but also some of the larger nerve bundles in there. So bundles of nerve fibers gathered together, or individual nerve fibers coming up as part of the sensation of the skin. And pretty soon here we're going to be talking about the different kinds of receptors, sensory receptors in the skin, most of which are in the dermis or in the hypodermis of the skin. So anyway, you've got a nervous system supply, you've got a blood system supply, you've got your hair, your sebaceous glands, your different sweat glands, erector pili muscle, all of these found in the dermis of the skin, as well as the sensory receptors we'll talk about in a minute. Now, down below the dermis here, we're going to have the fat. I'm going to draw fat in as a bunch of orange circles here. So this represents my adipose tissue, the fat layer, and the hypodermis layer of the skin. So down here we're in hypodermis. Typically, the base of a sweat gland, the base of your hair follicle, extend all the way down into the hypodermis of the skin. And depending on where you're talking about on the body, that hypodermis can be very thick or it can be very, very thin. Running out of room to write things on here. It's very crowded in all this stuff. So here's our hypodermis. I don't even think that's on my screen, is it? But anyway, that layer right there is hypodermis. In the hypodermis, you're going to see larger blood vessels in that zone, and they branch out and become smaller as they move toward the surface. There'll be smaller ones also, but you can find some of your larger ones down there, the larger vessels of the skin in the hypodermis. Same with nerves. Larger nerve bundles branch out and become smaller nerve bundles as they approach the surface. And as I said, bases of our hair follicles, bases of our glands usually come down into that hypodermis layer, down into the fat tissue layer. So loose connective tissue up here in the where we have the dermal papillae, the little bumps of dermis that stick up into our epidermis. Then we have the thicker reticular layer of the dermis, and that's tougher and more resilient. And that's what we make leather from. Then below that, your hypodermis, which is mostly fat and loose connective tissue mixed in there. So those are the elements that make up these different layers of the skin, the dermis and hypodermis layer of the skin. Next, we're going to talk about the specific sensory receptor types found in the skin and the integument. Okay, now we're going to be talking about nerve endings in the skin. So I've drawn on the board here already the epidermis with a hair follicle associated with it. Let's see. We're going to be first talking about two particular types of nerve endings that are not encapsulated. So these are non-encapsulated nerve endings of the skin. And the first one is what we simply refer to as a free nerve ending. That's when a nerve fiber comes up toward the surface, and at its end, that nerve is just a naked nerve ending, just a nerve fiber out there by itself. Some of these nerve endings will actually penetrate the basement membrane and extend maybe a short distance in among your epithelial cells. Usually we associate the nerve endings, though, with dermis down here so that they would just radiate out within the dermis tissue. So anyway, free nerve endings. Free nerve endings. The modalities, and when we talk about modalities, we're talking about the kind of sensation. We're talking about pain is one modality, heat, cold, touch, itch, tickle. All of those things are types of sensations you associate with free nerve endings. I'll go ahead and list those. Pain, touch, heat, cold, itch, tickle. Anyway, just naked, bare nerve endings that are out there. The second kind of non-encapsulated nerve ending associated with the skin is associated with the base of a hair follicle. And that nerve fiber will come up here and it will wrap around the base of this hair, looping around here, and it often has branches that do the same thing here. We go around. So it kind of wraps around the base of a hair follicle. This simply detects the displacement of a hair. So if a hair is moved, when something touches your hair, you're able to detect it. So we simply call these a hair root plexus. Hair root plexus, and they simply detect movement of the hair. Deflection of the hair is their only function. So those are two types of non-encapsulated nerve endings. The free nerve endings that have a variety of modalities, and the hair root plexus that has only the one, the deflection of the hair. Now we're going to look at 5 different types of receptors in the skin that are described as encapsulated. And the first one is not very much encapsulated, but let's go ahead and make a list of them, and then we're going to kind of draw and illustrate each of the types. So the encapsulated nerve endings of the skin, we're going to include the Merkel's receptor, we've mentioned it already because we've talked about the Merkel cell, and it's really not very well encapsulated. There's a cell associated with the end of the nerve fiber, but it doesn't really wrap around it. They just come in contact with each other. But anyway, we're going to include it here. It could be included very easily with the non-encapsulated nerve ending group there. So Merkel's receptor. Meissner's corpuscle is found in the dermal papillae. It's for the sense of touch. Pacinian corpuscle is a a large encapsulated nerve ending found in the hypodermis for the sense of pressure in the skin. The Ruffini corpuscles are in the dermis of the skin, and they can detect stretch or distension, tension within the skin layers, the Ruffini corpuscle. And finally, the end bulb of Krauss, very similar to a Ruffini corpuscle, more spherical and smaller, and the exact modality or function of that has been in some debate, some question about exactly how that functions, but we'll illustrate it anyhow. So those are our encapsulated nerve endings. Now let's try to make some pictures, little drawings of each of those. So here are our first two receptor types, encapsulated nerve ending types in the skin. And we've already drawn this once before when we were talking about the skin cell types in the epidermis. And this right here would be the Merkel cell. And it's in the stratum basal layer of the epidermis, and right here next to it is a nerve fiber. And there's a little expansion of the nerve fiber right at the very end that's sometimes referred to as Merkel's disc. Merkel's disc right there at the base of the Merkel cell. So that's a type of touch receptor in the skin. Another kind of touch receptor in the skin here is Meissner's corpuscle. As it approaches it's always found within a dermal papilla. As it approaches the dermal papilla, it undergoes kind of a twist as it heads up through there, and it's surrounded by cells that are similar to Schwann cells. They're a protective layer of cells that encapsulate that twisted nerve ending. So anyway, this is Meissner's corpuscle. Another touch receptor type found in the skin, mainly in areas where you have a well-developed dermal papillae in the skin. Okay, our next types of encapsulated nerve endings are pretty classic types of nerve endings. This is a Pacinian corpuscle here. We've already mentioned that it is a pressure receptor found in the hypodermis layer of the skin, so deep in the skin, so you detect more intense pressure. It's surrounded by layers of cushioning cells, special cells, again, modified cells, probably similar to Schwann cells. But anyway, these modified cells encapsulate a single nerve fiber that runs right through the middle of the Pacinian corpuscle. Again, it's found in the hypodermis and it senses pressure. Very large type of receptor. Most of them would probably be visible to the naked eye if you could sort them out and separate them from the other tissues in there. But very large, this whole structure here is very large structure. Next, the Ruffini corpuscle, I mentioned it's found in the dermis of the skin. It detects distension of the skin, stretching, tension within the skin. So this is the Ruffini corpuscle. And it is pretty much surrounded by connective tissues on the outside, and then there's a fluid matrix surrounding the nerve fibers, but highly branched nerve fiber within a capsule, connective tissue capsule, surrounded by fluid there. Very similar to that in structure, but much smaller and more spherical in shape, is the end bulb of Krauss. You could call it Krauss's corpuscle, but it was originally known as, I think, the end bulb of Krauss. And I'm not sure exactly what the modality associated with that would best be described as. Some say it's more of a sensation, some said originally that it was a type of cold receptor in the skin. But anyway, that finishes out our different types of encapsulated nerve endings within the skin.